Hey, Shalom, this is Dan, and I want to talk to you today about our next Torah portion, which is called Yitro. Now, Yitro is the Hebrew word for Jethro, and we're not talking about Jethro Tull, but we're talking about Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. Now, if you remember back, we had Zipporah, who her and her sisters they were saved by Moses when he escaped out of Egypt, and so they were at the well, they had some issues, and here comes Moses, and he defends the daughters of Jethro. And so eventually Moses was given Zipporah as a wife. Well, if you think about what's happened over the time here, you realize that we kind of lose Zipporah in the story here. Now, I want to pick up from where this section actually begins, and again, this parashah is called Yitro, and we read that Jethro brought his daughters and grandchildren to see Moses. Now, when I read this, and this is coming out of I believe it's Exodus 18:5. Let me just make sure of my text here real quick. Yeah, it says Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' sons and wife to him in the desert where he was encamped. So, in order for them to have been brought to them, it makes me kind of wonder, well, when exactly did they leave? Did they leave while the plagues were going on? Did they leave maybe right after the Red Sea and go, meet up with Jethro and hang out with them for a while Moses took care of the rest of the stuff and the people coming back over? Or was it that during the war with the Amalekites, I remember when Moses had his hands up, when her and Aaron were holding his hands up, did they leave around that time during the war with the Amalekites, and now they're being brought back? The Bible doesn't really tell us exactly what happened. It just says that here in verse 5 that they came back. Well, when they came back with Jethro, and Jethro kind of surveyed what was going on there, and he realized that there were some things that Moses was doing that maybe he didn't need to be doing. Now, first of all, they encouraged each other, and this is what I really love about this part of the story, is that they both took the opportunity to explain to each other what exactly Adonai had been doing, how he had been blessing them. I'm sure Moses shared stories about how they did get their escape and the plagues and all, and how they crossed the Red Sea. And Jethro, he probably had heard these stories, but he's sharing his own stories too about how his faith in God, his confidence in God is being built up because of this. Now, I want to share this with you because this is really, I think, cool. There's a saying that if you see the blessing of someone, and this is in Hebrew, if you see the blessing, then it just means that you're in line next. Well, I've been in a position where it seems as though God is blessing me. God is giving me opportunities at work for growth, and God is bringing about finances, and God is just taking care of me in a lot of different ways. And I love it because with this being the case, that if people see it, then they're next in line, then it makes me encouraged because it means that I saw something, so that I was next in line, but it also gives me this awesome feeling to know that those who are seeing me become blessed and those who are seeing God's favor upon me, they're going to be the next ones to be blessed. There are things happening, and I'll share as we go on here, but there are things happening in these months and in the next few months to come that God is just pouring out new things to me, and he's really doing something in me that has me excited. And I feel like I'm like Moses and Jethro, and we're just sitting around the campfire and we're sharing stories about all the blessings that God has done. And I'm real excited about that. I believe this is kind of how it was for these guys as well. And they exchanged the blessings, and they got to know the different ways that God was working, because God doesn't always work the same way at the same time. He might bring someone a new car by method number A, or method letter A, but he might bring me a new car by method B, or he might bring you a new car by method C, or however he chooses to do it, and whatever he chooses to do. He doesn't always work in the same ways, but he wants to bless us regardless of how he works. His end result is for us to be blessed. But that actually segues into the next portion, because, no, it doesn't. I'm sorry. skips into another portion. But let's go on in this story first. We see that Jethro has come, and I told you that Jethro noticed some things that were going on that maybe shouldn't have been going on, or that Moses didn't need to spend his time on. So in chapter 18, verse 18 of Exodus, we see that Jethro kind of comments that Moses is going to wear himself out if he continues to do these things. Now, what exactly was Moses doing? Well, he wasn't doing anything bad. He was just exhausting his energy. He was becoming not only the leader of these people, but he was also their judge. And they'd come up to him and they'd ask him to sort out some of the conflicts they were having there in the camp. And when Jethro saw this, he said, you know what you need to do? You need to take some God-fearing men, some men who are above reproach, who are going to be fair in the judgments, and you need to put them in charge of judging. And only the tough cases should come to you. Now, that obviously is called delegation. And I got to be honest with you, when I was growing up, I had this thing where I didn't really like to delegate work to other people. Now, I didn't like to work all the work myself, but there were some things that I figured, you know what, I'm going to do it because I know that I'm going to do it the way I want it to be done. And it's just going to get done the way I want it. One of those things, I grew up in choir. I was a choir boy. But I also used to paint some of the sets for the choir scenery and then also for the drama club and stuff like that as well. And so it came down to where I had these pictures in my mind of how I wanted things to be done, and then I would do them. And when other people come to help, I would make sure that I gave them just the smallest of jobs, not because I wanted to be in control, but because I wanted it to look the exact way that it was in my head. But there was one time where it came down to the crunch time. I had 5 panels to paint still. I had 2 days to do it. I was already staying at school way beyond what I should, plus trying to get homework done and all this type of stuff. And it was just becoming a hassle. And so it finally came down to I had to break down and ask people for help. I had to delegate some of the responsibilities. And, did the sets all look the way I had in my head? No. But you know what? They got done. And I think now, I look back and I say, man, I could not have got these things done if someone hadn't come and helped. I was wearing myself thin, and Moses was doing the exact same thing. He was wearing himself thin. He was trying to be the leader of these people, and he was trying to judge these people and spending time with God and all this type of stuff, and it got to be too much. And Jethro saw it, and before it got to be crazy, Jethro said, you got to delegate. Moses, you got to delegate. And so Moses did. And he put some men in charge. And he put them in charge of sections. And he put them in charge of bigger sections. And these guys were in charge of big sections. And eventually just the tough cases came to Moses. Now, I gave you a segue and then I left you hanging. But I'm going to come back to that segue now. Because we see this thing about treasure. We move into Exodus chapter 19. We see that God has called his people treasure. Now, I left you with this whole thing about watching God's working and the blessing and how he wants to bless us. But let me ask you this. In order for us to be his treasure, what do we have to do? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Here's what we're told to do in Exodus 19. In order to become the treasure of God, God lays down these rules that we have to obey his words and keep his covenant. You see, God, he's doing his part for us. God's already said that he loves us beyond anything that we could ever imagine. He's already opening doors for us. He's already got this whole pile, think about it in a treasure box. He's got this whole treasure box full of blessings that he wants to open up for us to have. But his only rules are, you got to keep my covenant and you got to obey what I say. I'll give you all this treasure if you do those 2 things. And I wonder sometimes, do we really do it? Do we keep his covenant? What is his covenant? In chapter 20 of Exodus, he gives us the 10 commandments, the 10 mitzvot. I'm sorry. Are we actually doing these things? Are we keeping these commandments? I mean, some of them are easy, obviously. I don't really plan on going out and killing anybody physically, but I kill people with my words. I don't plan on stealing anything, but then, well, sometimes I take stuff home from work that I didn't buy. I don't keep all the covenants, all the commandments. How about having no other gods before me? Can I honestly say that I have never had another God before me? No. No, I violated that one as well. What else is there? Have I ever taken the Lord's name in vain? Yeah, I probably have. I know I have. Have I ever disrespected my parents? Yeah. All these things God wants to bless us with, we can't get if we're living in this life of sin. If we are living in this position where we're not obeying His word and we're not keeping His covenant. I want this to be a challenge to you just as much as it was to me when I was reading over this section. You know, I got to take inventory of my life. I got to see, according to the rules that we have, this 10 Commandments, which ones am I keeping, if any, and what am I going to do with the ones I'm not keeping? But you know what? Let me let you know a little clue here. These are only 10 Commandments. If you read the entire Torah, it says that there is actually quite a few more. There's commandments about sacrifice. There's commandments about Shabbat. There's commandments about everything. In fact, they say there's about 613 commandments in the Torah alone. Are we keeping all of them? You can argue with the fact that Jesus didn't come to, well, it says Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to get rid of it, right? It says that in Matthew, I believe Matthew 5. And it's true, Jesus didn't come to say, forget that, it's okay to steal. He didn't come and say, it's all right to have an adulterous relationship. No, he didn't say any of that. He came to show us how to do it. This is how that's actually read. He didn't come to do away with the words of Moses, but he came to show us how we're supposed to live this out. I want to leave you with one more thing here. And I find this kind of interesting, kind of freaky, but kind of cool as well. It talks about the way God speaks. Now, we know that in John, when after Peter had denied Christ, there's this whole thing about feed my sheep. And we know that there's this verse that says that we're considered his sheep. And so if we are his sheep, then his sheep know his voice. But God doesn't always speak the same way, just as he doesn't always give us blessings the same way. So think about this. You have one of my favorite stories, and is where Elijah was on the Mount Horeb, I believe it was, or Mount Carmel, and he was talking. He was running away from Jezebel. He had just done this really cool thing, and so now he was fearful, and he runs away, and he goes on to the top of the mountain as he's told by God. And what does God say? You know, there's this thunder and God's not in there, and then there's this earthquake and he's not in there, and there's all these things happening, but then it says that he heard a still small voice, and that's where God's voice was. But that's contrasting to what we read here in Exodus, where we see that this time God spoke as thunder and lightning and like the blast of a shofar, the blast of a trumpet. God is God, and he's sovereign, and he can do whatever he wants to do, whenever he wants to do it. He's not always going to do the same thing the same way. But God, in this case, speaks. Sometimes he's going to speak to us loudly, and sometimes he's going to speak to us real quiet, and we got to listen, or we're going to miss it. I want to challenge you as we leave with this. God speaks. Are you listening? You know, there was a song by Out of the Gray back in the day, back in the 80s, I think it was, maybe early 90s, and it said, you know, we're not listening. Is basically what it says. It says that he is not quiet, he is not whispering. We are not quiet, we are not listening. I want to challenge you. There's going to be times when God speaks real quiet and we need to listen. And there's going to be times when God booms his voice and we get caught off guard. Those are the ones we probably hear the best because they're so loud. It's like a horn honking. But yeah, I just got this picture. You know, I'm walking down the sidewalk a couple days ago, and this car honked, and my reaction was, "Oh my gosh, what was that?" But it's the same kind of thing. There's gonna be times when God just whispers, and there's gonna be times when God says, "Hey, I'm trying to get your attention." Listen. Listen to God's voice. And going back to the section before this, God wants to bless you, but you got to do two things. You got to obey him and keep his covenant. This is Dan. Shalom.